Greetings, everybody. This is Brent Robbins, and I'm here with Ashley Bobak.
Hey, everyone.
I'm a professor of psychology at Point Park University in our clinical psychology PsyD program. I'm a core faculty member there. And Ashley Bobak is one of our doctoral candidates who defended her dissertation, is finishing up internship. Where are you doing your internship, Ashley?
At SUNY Upstate Medical University in Syracuse.
Yeah, so you'll be done in August and then you'll be graduated.
Yep. It's been a long time coming.
Dr. Bobak at that point. So yeah, so I'm very excited that Ashley is going to have an opportunity to present the work that she did on her dissertation that I shared using a metabletic approach. And that's really what this presentation is going to be about. So when we're doing metabletics, what we mean by metabletics is we're using a method of phenomenology developed by the Dutch phenomenologist Jan Hendrik van den Berg, which studies how psychological constructs change over time, historically and culturally, by looking at major shifts in cultural understandings of the self, in the psyche, in the context of other social and cultural events that are happening at the time. So in the case of Ashley's analysis, she's looking at mid-19th century France as a pivotal moment in the shift towards a medical or disease model of addiction. So I'll just leave it at that and hand the ball to Ashley and let her run with it, because she has a lot to say and want to make sure she has lots of runway to say what she needs to say. So go ahead, Ashley.
All right. Thanks, Brent. All right. You're seeing that okay?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, as Brent said, I'm going to talk about my dissertation and the metabletic analysis that I conducted for my dissertation. So very broadly speaking, I wanted to understand what led to this shift in understanding substance addiction as a disease. So Metabletics is really interested in looking at major shifts or changes within history and trying to understand how they came about. Preface in the understanding that everything is grounded in the time period, the historical, situational, political, societal context. So therefore, this understanding that addiction is disease didn't just like drop down from the sky one day, but was really grounded and embedded in history and society, politics, et cetera. And as Brent mentioned, I do have a lot to cover. So I'll do my best to cover it in a way that hopefully flows well and doesn't go too fast, but I'm going to spend the bulk of my presentation just talking about the metabletic analysis itself. And then I'll spend a little bit of time at the end talking about like the implications for it. So like, what do we do with this understanding? And in my dissertation, I'm using what Brent and I have called a critical metabletics. So sort of a moving away from, or I guess maybe a new take on van den Berg's more traditional metabletics, and that van den Berg was more sort of descriptive in his approach. So describing different historical shifts or changes, whereas the approach that we're arguing is more prescriptive. So sort of taking this analysis, looking at, okay, what can we do with this information and where does this lead us? And as I mentioned, I'll talk a little bit at the end of my presentation about implications for treatment and for understanding addiction that we can glean from this analysis. Okay, so just a very broad overview of my findings. So I started with looking at historical accounts of substance addiction in the Western world. And typically Metabletics sort of has one kind of like anchor book or piece that everything else is kind of built off of. For me, that was David Courtwright's Dark Paradise, A History of Opiate Addiction in America. And this is really key because it illuminated the origins of the medical models of mental illness and substance addiction in Benedict August Morrell's theory of degeneration. And we're going to spend some time talking about Morrill and his theory a little bit more. But very broadly speaking, his theory proposes both a moral and a hereditary conceptualization of mental illness. And through the analysis, which led both Brent and I to very surprising and kind of strange places, we were able to ground Morrill's theory in the societal and political context of a post-revolution France, and also revealed connections between the theory of degeneration in literature, the occult, spiritism, physics, early and modern psychology, logical positivism, and eugenics. So yeah, Brent was not joking when he said we have a lot of ground to cover in this presentation. Okay, so very, very broad picture. So looking more specifically at Morrill, because a lot of this analysis centered on his idea. So Morrill, one thing that's important to know about his background is that he was a very devout Catholic. He was born in Austria in 1809 to French parents. And again, was a devout Catholic, was even attended a seminary, which he got kicked out of due to his support of a liberal Catholic Lemonet, who I'm going to talk about a little bit more later on in this. But just keeping in mind that, yeah, Morrill also has his own sort of historical, political, societal context, and Catholicism was a key piece of that for him. So in 1857, which is a really key year in this analysis, we'll see it come up a few times throughout my talk here tonight. So in 1857, he publishes his treatise on physical, intellectual, and moral degeneration. And very broadly speaking, Morrill understands mental illness and addiction as a deviation from normality that's either caused by physical injury or moral indiscretions, and is both hereditary and influenced by the individual's environment. And Morrill believed that degeneration was something that would be passed along the family line, leading each new generation of family members to become more and more degenerative, more and more sort of deteriorating, eventually culminating in family members becoming totally sterile and ultimately leading to the total destruction of family trees over time, which is also something important to keep in mind, an idea that we'll return to. Interestingly, in my analysis, I found that Morrill's use of the term dementia praecox precedes that of German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin, who we all know is really well known for his development of psychiatric classification, which really influenced the DSM and ICD classifications of psychosis and schizophrenia. So I was surprised to come across that. And actually, digging deeper, we found more connections between Kraepelin and Morrill. So they shared very similar ideologies. Actually, Kraepelin's famous article titled On Degeneration talks about how modern society is responsible for a number of medical issues and conditions, similar to kind of what Morrill was saying. And also that psychiatrists were responsible for treating these ills. And that's something that I'll talk a little bit more about later, but Morrill shared that same idea that, you know, psychiatry is responsible to address degeneration. Morrill, you know, thought that the medical field was responsible for taking a look at both the short-term and long-term effects of the social environment on health, as well as how to treat and prevent health problems that arise from the ills of society. And he really went as far to say that medicine can provide like salvation to an ailing society. So here we see some of his Catholic roots kind of leading through. They also both believed in taking preventative measures to address degeneration, such as like educating the public, taking measures to eliminate alcohol use and syphilis, addressing and improving living and environmental conditions, and providing assistance to the poor. So again, both Kraepelin and Morrill had very similar shared ideas. We can also see Morrill's Catholicism sort of bleed through into his theory in his discussion of degeneration as a fall from grace. And his later writings refer to degeneration as being really reflective of aberrations from God's creation. So he thought degeneration was a pathological deviation that was caused by original sin, which was representative of man obeying God's moral law. And we can really see this in his discussion of degeneration by intoxication, where basically he's saying that people that used alcohol or drugs are stupid, that they lack any sense of morality or ability to tell right from wrong. And again, like all forms of degeneration, Morrill talked about degeneration by intoxication is something that's sort of passed along the family line, which is ultimately results in the destruction of the family line itself. So Morrill's emphasis on both the moral side of degeneration, but also the more hereditary genetic side of degeneration really influenced, and how this contributed to the deterioration of society, really influenced eugenics movements. So very broadly speaking, eugenics movements operate under the assumption that the human population can be improved in some way by applying genetic and evolutionary principles. And they were really interested in the domains of race, class, socioeconomic status, with this ultimate goal being to develop a master race of human beings. Eugenics is something that I'm going to return to and talk about more, but I think we can already see from this side the darker side of maybe more disease models and where they can lead to. And we see that this sort of end of creating a master race of human beings was sought after through a number of policies and procedures aimed at deeming people deemed unfit from reproducing, such as through marriage restrictions, segregation laws, forced sterilization of people deemed unfit, like criminals or prostitutes, racial or ethnic minorities, intellectually disabled individuals, and ultimately, as we see in the case of Nazi Germany, euthanasia. So again, and that's sort of going to be a message that I return to, is sort of understanding the history of where our theories and where our ideas come from is really important, because without understanding those, again, it can lead us to repeating history and lead us to some very dangerous and dark places. And Kraepelin was also a proponent of eugenics. So he thought that in order to improve the health of the German population, that eugenic measures like racial hygiene should be implemented. So themes of degeneration aren't only prevalent in psychiatry and the eugenics movement, but also in the literary world. So we're going to talk a little bit next about the decadence movement. So the decadence movement was an aesthetic primary literary movement that began in the early mid-19th century and ended in the 1880s, 1890s. So again, sort of same time frame as Morrill that we're talking about here. So the decadence movement, very broadly speaking, captures themes of wanting to escape from the ennui of existence, as well as sickness, decay, perversion, artificiality, and asceticism. So here we see a large emphasis on illness and degeneration, but whereas Morrill is sort of warning against the dangers of degeneration and how society is creating these like degenerate individuals, the decadence movement, on the other hand, is really celebrating it. So they're celebrating decadence or degeneration as being productive and beautiful. They really seem to enjoy writing about sort of morbid things like illness, illness of self, illness of others. And for decadence, this sort of preoccupation with sickness and decay went beyond just writing about them, but really desiring them. And for one way to sort of capture experiences of sickness and decay, or to transform one's reality, is through using drugs. So one of the major figures in the decadence movement was Charles Baudelaire. So Baudelaire writes Les Fleurs du Mal, or Flowers of Evil, in 1857, again, the same year as Morrell's treatise on degeneration. So again, 1857 is an important year in this analysis. And that's part of what we're doing in Metabletic. So looking, again, as Brent mentioned, looking at a particular time period and trying to see what was going on within that time period, within individuals within that society during the time period, and sort of looking for similarities across disciplines. So here again, we're seeing connections already between psychiatry and literature. So like other decadents, Baudelaire's work really captures themes of degeneration, decay, immorality. But again, rather than sort of warning against them as Morrell did, Baudelaire is celebrating them. So, and like other decadents, Baudelaire also talks about drug use as a way to alter or escape reality and experience the transcendent. And we can see this in his poem, Get Drunk, that I have on the PowerPoint slide here. So he talks about it as sort of like getting away from the backbreaking, body-bending burdens of time as a way to sort of escape the mundane. And he also writes about drug use in his book, Artificial Paradise, where he talks about using a lot of different substances like alcohol, stimulants, opium, as a way to experience the supernatural or transcendent. So then this led us to take a look at the occult in decadence. So just like drug use was one way for the decadents to sort of access or transform reality in some kind of way, Black magic in the occult provided another way for Baudelaire and the decadents to alter reality and gain new perceptual experiences. So very, very broadly speaking, occultism is an umbrella term for a range of philosophical, scientific, and religious discourses that aim to uncover hidden esoteric knowledge available for the initiated. And we can see the influence of the occult on a lot of decadence writings and a lot of Baudelaire's writings, but one place that it's really clear to see this is in his poem Litanies of Satan, that's featured in Les Fleurs du Mal. And in Litanies of Satan, Baudelaire reimagines Jesus Christ as God's victim rather than humankind's savior, who's calling out in prayer to Satan to be relieved of his earthly sufferings. And in addition to Satanism, which a lot of decadents were drawn to because it was sort of their way of breaking away from traditional bourgeois religious beliefs, and again, another way to transform reality, we also see other occult themes like cartography as being used as a way to unlock secrets of the occult. This idea that the occult and magical practices have scientific foundations, which I'm actually going to talk in a little bit about the ties between the occult and logical positivism, which I think was one of the surprises that Brent and I came across while doing this work. And then also this idea that there's some kind of repressed history that we're trying to uncover. And Spiritism, which is a religious movement similar to the occult, which used mediums and other means by which to contact the dead, believe that sickness could facilitate communication between the living and the dead. And I'll talk a little bit more about Spiritism in a moment. So one of the major figures in the occult movement was Eliphas Levi, and he starts writing about occultism in 1851. So again, around the same time frame as Morrell and as Baudelaire are also writing. And Levi linked the occult to a socialist, true, and universal religious tradition, Catholicism, which he believed had degenerated from its true origins in the heresy of false Gnosticism. So here we see a tie between Levi and Morrell with this idea of a more like socialist kind of Catholicism, which I'll talk more about Morrell's ties to socialist Catholicism a little bit. But then we also see ties between Baudelaire and Levi. So Levi and Baudelaire were both influenced by Joseph de Maistre, who was a late 18th, early 19th century Catholic philosopher who promoted a more sort of traditional approach to Catholicism and really influenced Baudelaire's understandings of sin and evil. And actually, in addition to having this tie of like sort of an influence on their thought, Levi and Baudelaire also personally knew one another and influenced each other's work. So I think that was another surprise in this analysis, which I think was one of the great things about Metabletics, is that you never know like what you're going to find initially. But I think initially when I started working on my analysis and Brent and I were talking with one another, we sort of thought like, okay, we're going to have these sort of like thematic theme of degeneration that we're going to see across disciplines. But as we started digging deeper, we were kind of amazed at like, oh, wow, like all these guys like actually knew each other in addition to having this, this theme. And I'll talk more about other surprising connections too in a little bit. So like the decadents, Levi also had ties to Satanism, although kind of reluctantly. So he was criticized by Catholic demonologists for communicating with demons. But he just sort of countered these critical Catholic demonologists with a complete denial of the devil altogether. But his infamous drawing of the Baphomet, which is pictured here, which was published in 1854, so just a few years before Morel and Baudelaire's work, depicts this androgynous, horned, goat-like demonic creature, and as we all know, has since become a favored symbol of Satanists. So as much as he tried to distance himself from the Satanists, didn't really work. And Levi also used drugs as a way to access the occult, like the decadents. He actually used a number of different drugs like hashish, opium, narcotic fungi, that he used to create these sort of psychoactive, what he called fumigations, which were commonly used by occultists during seances and have a really long history of being used in witchcraft and dark magic. And it was believed that the cultivation of altered states of consciousness during these rituals allowed participants to conjure and experience the presence of spirits and apparitions. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the ties between the occult, positivism, and art. So as I mentioned, Levi was sort of interested in uncovering one true universal Catholicism, and he was also interested in developing universal science, which involved the synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy, which really later came to underline his conceptualizations of magic. He understood magic as being very closely aligned with science and thought that they sort of reconciled one another. And he understood his esoteric Catholicism, the occult, and science as all being in service one another. And so we also interestingly see these ideas mirrored in logical positivism, which is the philosophy of modern science and psychology. So in a kind of an unexpected place, considering that logical positivism emerges near the end of the 19th century, and also urged for united universal science, much like Levi was arguing for. But logical positivism thought this could be done through the building up of basic propositions and concepts. And logical positivism was also interested in sort of ridding science of all of the metaphysical and really just focusing solely on the observables, what can be measured and observed. Interestingly, though, maybe kind of ironically, the father of logical positivism, Auguste Comte, believed that logical positivism could serve as a universal secular religion, or a religion of humanity. And actually, his secular religion of positivism really played off the rituals and rites of Catholicism and suggested that positivism serves as a replacement to Catholicism. Except for Comte, instead of sort of revering God, it was more a worship of humanity itself. And as we all know, Comte's worldview ultimately leads to a conceptualization of the person as machine, as seen in behaviorism and cognitive psychologies. Also, interestingly and ironically, despite their push and pull to remove the metaphysical from the world of science. We found that a number of notable positivists were really interested in and investigated occult phenomena. So one such figure was Otto Neurath. He was a prominent positivist thinker who was part of the Vienna Circle, which was just a group of individuals who were really committed to logical positivism. He was involved in the occult, and he thought that positivism was a substitute for magic or a revival or recovery of magic. And he thought that the physicist was really akin to a magician, and that they're both using empirical means to attempt to predict change. And yeah, that's one thing that I didn't mention earlier, but the occultists, like the positivists, were trying to sort of create this universal science, which could be created through building up basic propositions and concepts. The occultists also were trying to unveil the scientific operating principles and laws of nature, which they thought laid under the metaphysical, like various magical practices like necromancy, astrology. Much like the logical positivists, we're also trying to sort of build up these basic propositions and concepts. So again, a lot of parallels. And Neurath wasn't the only notable positivist interested in and investigating the occult. There were a number of other members of the Vienna Circle who were also investigating paranormal phenomena. So again, kind of ironic considering these guys were the ones trying to sort of get rid of the metaphysical. And we also see positivism tied back to Baudelaire in the work of French painter Gustave Courbet. So Courbet, Baudelaire critiqued Courbet's work, and Courbet painted Baudelaire's portrait on a couple of occasions. And the two were friends. They corresponded with one another and spent quite a bit of time together. So Courbet's positivist approach to artwork really placed an emphasis on observables and a denial of the metaphysical. He asserted that life was biologically as opposed to divinely created, and really criticized the church and state for employing religious fears of damnation as a way to instill fear in and manage the population. And Comte believed that positivism could be used as a replacement for ineffective political systems, and felt that artists played an integral role in both understanding and communicating positivist conceptualizations of past and future social development. So as such, much like Comte perceived himself and his proposed secular religion of humanity as being really key to saving humanity, Courbet believed that he was really this sort of pinnacle figure in the movement to cure social problems. And these beliefs were really reaffirmed by individuals like Baudelaire, who in 1855 describes Courbet as saving the world. So we see similarities between Courbet, Comte, and Morel as all having the savior sort of complex, that we can use positivism to like save humanity or save the world, or Morel that psychiatry is going to save humanity itself. Okay, so I mentioned Spiritism briefly earlier in connection to the occult. And again, Spiritism was a religious movement that thought that you could communicate with the dead through use of seances and mediums and things like that. I also mentioned that sickness was one way that they believed that communication with the dead could be facilitated. And even though the Spiritists promoted occultist belief, there was like separation between the Spiritists and the occults. Levi really heavily criticized them as being amateurs and took issue with them. But interestingly, so we see this year 1857 pop up yet again when the Spirits book, which is the primary text which launched the movement, is published by Allan Kardec. And Kardec really initiates the French Spiritist movement. And again, as I noted, the Spiritists believed in an existence of a spirit realm and felt that dead spirits could be communicated with through mediums and seances. And they talked about the role that illness plays. And we also found ties between Spiritism and modern psychology. So Carl Jung's maternal family members were involved in Spiritism, and he participated in seances led by one of his cousins. As I'm sure we all know, Jung also believed in the existence of a spirit realm and spirits, which he designated as the psychoid archetype, which really emphasized the role of this archetype as a bridge between worlds. He also shared a number of similarities with Kardec. So they both incorporated some ideas from Hinduism. They were both really well read in the sciences, but advocated a metaphysical approach. Both carried out experiments to substantiate their ideas, and both rejected the institutionalized religions of their childhood. So a lot of like similarities between the two. In addition to family connections for Jung between Spiritism and Jung, we also see influences between both Jung and Freud to the occult through the French hypnotists who influenced them. So French psychologist and hypnotist Pierre Janet, who really influenced Jung's work, had an interest in Spiritism and the occult, as seen in his studies of mediums. And French neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot, who influenced Freud, believed that hypnotism could be used in the service of research and as a way to debunk the occult movement. So for Charcot, he believed that Spiritism could trigger hysteria and neurosis in those susceptible to it. And we see Freud really taking this up. So we know that he's very critical of religion and the spiritual and opted for a more sort of rationalist approach to understanding reality. And as we all know, Freud and Jung's differences of opinion on the occult and spirit and religious experiences ultimately leads to their infamous split. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that we also saw ties we're understanding this analysis within the context of a post-revolution France. So we see during this time, and we can see this in Freud and Jung's differing perspectives on the issue of occult and religion, is also really reflective of this divide between Orthodox Catholics, folk tradition Catholics like Levi, and positivist physicians during the time period that we're looking at. And we see this divide being really influenced by competing understandings of hysteria and demonic possession, and then how to approach healing or treatment. So just like in a nutshell, the Orthodox Catholic Church understands demonic possession as something that requires exorcisms performed by Catholic priests, whereas folk tradition Catholics and occultists like Levi look for healing and understanding through localized folk medicine and practices. And then we have the positivist anti-clerical physicians like Charcot, who assert that, you know, what appears to Catholics as possession is really hysteria, and we need professional intervention through hypnosis. And we can see this division as being really rooted in the French Revolution, where very broadly speaking, we see the bourgeois class rise up against the monarchy and Catholic Church due to social and economic inequalities present in French society. As I'll mention like briefly though, we ultimately see the positive sort of win this fight. And part of it, sort of hypothesizing, is that the church actually, interestingly, sort of makes a positivist turn. So in my research, we found that so the Catholic Church was accused of being really backwards and as ignorant, as inhibiting scientific and social progress. So the church tries to sort of counter these critiques by creating a coalition of Catholic physicians to document clinical observations and the phenomenological experiences of individuals miraculously cured at Lourdes, which is a site where a shepherdess experienced 18 visions of the Virgin Mary. So I think maybe in some ways, despite the pushback from the Catholic Church, the Catholic Church's positivist turn by way of like trying to empirically validate miracles sort of leads to this more positivist understanding of hysteria taking hold, and really forms the basis for modern understandings of mental illness. And I'll talk more in a little bit how we see the more sort of moral or religious pieces of morals theory of degeneration slowly being stripped away by positivists over time and leaving us with what we might see more as like the disease model understanding of mental illness and addiction. Okay, so yeah, we see these sort of divides between the Orthodox Catholics, folk Catholics, and positivists as really being rooted in the French Revolution. So again, I have a lot to cover, so I'm not going to be able to fully do this justice, but just very briefly, we might understand the Orthodox Catholic Church had ties with the aristocratic ruling classes who were involved in counter-revolutionary efforts, whereas we might associate the positivists with the anti-clericism of the revolution. Whereas the folk tradition Catholics were probably also associated with the counter-revolution, as they understood the revolution as an assault on their way of life, as during this time the churches were sold, priests were exiled and murdered. And additionally, the promises of the bourgeois who rose up against the monarchy because of these perceived social and economic inequalities. So they promised like the poorer classes, economic equality, those went unfulfilled, which ultimately harmed the rural and peasant classes to which the folk Catholics, tradition Catholics belonged. And this ultimately led to a failed revolt, the Vendée uprising, led by the poor and peasants, that ended in really brutal massacres of men, women, and children who were suspected of participating in the revolt. And we also see, even though we might understand the Catholics as sort of all being on one side, there were divisions within them. So there were the Jansenists and the Jesuits, which also sort of stoke the fires of the French Revolution. So the Jansenists sort of evolve into this more revolutionary branch of Catholicism that was really critical and questioning of the Pope and the monarchy. Whereas the Jesuits, on the other hand, were really defensive of the Pope and the monarchy. So on the counter-revolution side, and we see the Sacred Heart as being adopted as the image of the counter-revolution. And the cult of the Sacred Heart became a really important part of French political culture during the French Revolution. It was a countercultural image of the heart as a spiritual and psychological organ of love and compassion. And we see the Sacred Heart as being sort of connected to the Jesuits. So I have more to say on that, but in the interest of time, I'm gonna keep going. But this imagery was really important. Vandenberg also talks about the Sacred Heart in relation to William Harvey's discovery of the heart's physiological functions in 1628, which ultimately reduces the heart to a pump. And shortly after King Charles is executed. But really, the Sacred Heart is, again, adopted as the image of the counter-revolution associated with the monarchy and the Jesuits. And it was a pretty really politicized, understandably, and people were even executed for just wearing its image or distributing it. Okay. So ultimately what happens is, although the Jesuits, so again, they're the Catholics that were sort of in favor of the Pope and the monarchy, although they were forced underground during the revolution, they were ultimately reinstated to power. And the Jansenists, so again, these more sort of revolutionary Catholics who were critical of the Pope, were ultimately condemned as heretics and eliminating after the revolution. Okay. So what does all this have to do with degeneration? It seems like maybe we sort of got off on a tangent. Well, I'm going to like bring us back. So we see that this political turmoil and violence in France is really setting the stage for the events and players outlined in this analysis. So again, in Metabletics, we're really trying to understand the historical, political, societal context. And to do that for Morel, we need to, in Baudelaire and all these other folks we're talking about, we really need to understand what was going on in France at that time. So they're all sort of on the tail end of the French Revolution. After the French Revolution, there were many other revolutions following that. So it was just a time of total upheaval, turmoil, violence. And we see Morel sort of appearing as maybe like a transitional kind of figure between the revolutionaries and the counter-revolutionaries, as he's really sympathetic to the revolutionaries as a Catholic socialist and medical doctor, while also remaining Catholic. So here's where I'm going to talk more about Morel's Catholic roots. So he was really influenced by Lamennais' liberal Catholicism, who again, I mentioned, Lamennais was a socialist revolutionary who participated in the 1848 revolution, a revolution that was staged by French workers and was also really influenced by the radical revolutionaries of the French Revolution. And as I mentioned way at the beginning, Morel actually went to seminary, but because he supported Lamennais' liberal Catholicism, he was kicked out for it. So this guy, Lamennais, was really a revolutionary. He called for separation of church and state. He advocated for democratic freedoms like freedom of the press, political freedoms, and so on. He rejected papal authority. And again, like his revolutionary ideas and calls for reform in the Catholic Church were really compelling for young Catholics like Morel. And he also influenced Eliphas Levi, who we talked about earlier. And Morel was also influenced by, in addition to being influenced by Lamennais, he was also influenced by the social Catholicism of Philippe Boucher. So Boucher, like Lamennais, also participated in the 1848 revolution and tried to merge Catholicism with a sort of social justice oriented and democratic views. And Boucher and Morel were colleagues and friends and had a number of ideological connections. So both wrote about the moral decay of society, and which Boucher really attributed to societal trust in governments, who he thought that were just kind of self-serving. And Boucher sought to end this decay, and he thought the revolution was a major step in reinstilling French society with Christian morals. And we also see the similar ideas in Morel's own discussion of the moral decline of society, degeneration as being the result of original sin, and his call for psychiatry to serve as redemption of the masses. And we also see his influence, Boucher's influence on Morel in his description of degeneration as linked to moral illness. Degeneration as a product of moral illness addresses the genetic transmission of moral illness, which Morel tied to original sin, as well as the pathological consequences of lack of adequate moral and intellectual education provided to children and adolescents. We also see the influence of Boucher and Lamennais on Morel's emphasis on the role of physician as social healer or savior. So Morel really wanted to moralize the population. He thought that the masses had fallen away from morality and required medical intervention to be redeemed. But as we see the culture as a whole at the time sort of moving away from the mystical and the spiritual and towards a more positivist worldview, we see the spiritual and moral aspects of moral theory discarded in the favor of a more positivist reading of the generation. So here I'm going to talk very briefly about this positivist turn. So one place where we see sort of this move away from the spiritual aspects of morals theory to a positivist understanding is in French criminology. So French philosopher and psychologist Prosper Despines also, like moral, emphasizes the role of morality in pathology and describes criminals as lacking any kind of morality or remorse for their crimes. However, in addition to his emphasis or connections between lack of morality and criminality, Despines, in a more positivist move, attributes pathology to the brain. And we see others sort of following suit, like Valentin Magnin, the clinical head of the psychiatric asylum of St. Anne in Paris, starts writing on moral theory in 1882. And he was really interested in alcoholism and is really drawn to Morrell's idea that alcoholism is a hereditary illness. But here we see Magnin totally strip Morrell's theory of any religious or mystical influence, specifically his framing of degeneration as being tied to original sin. And he more frames degeneration in the context of evolutionary development, saying that degeneration is just a deviation from normal development. And French criminologists following suit of Despines use the theory of degeneration to advocate for the implementation of eugenic measures like castration, sterilization, execution for criminals as a way to prevent societal contamination. And then, as I sort of alluded to earlier, we also see this positivist reading of degeneration theory as really paving the way for the eugenics movement. So in 1892, Max Nordau publishes his book Degeneration, where he describes insanity, murder, crime, and contemporary art and literature as being symptomatic of modernity. He, in his book, Nordau, critiques contemporary artists and authors as degenerates and criminals, arguing that oftentimes degeneration is just misconstrued as artistic talent or genius. Nordau even diagnoses Baudelaire in his book, who he claims has a mystically degenerate mind. And he thought that physicians could sort of perform examinations on art, much like they could like the human body, and that you could like diagnose people through their artwork. And that's what he did with Baudelaire. And interestingly, despite like being Jewish and trying to label anti-Semitism as a form of degeneracy, Nordau's positivist conceptualization of degeneracy and critiques of contemporary art are taken up by Hitler and the Nazis in their attacks on degenerate art, which really culminates in the Nazis' 1937 Degenerate Art exhibition, where featured works of modern art were confiscated and sort of put on display by the Nazis. Okay, so here's where this also took like another sort of strange and unexpected turn. So in the 1850s, we see the second law of thermodynamics emerge, which states that although energy can't be destroyed, it eventually sort of dissipates or succumbs to entropy over time. So in other words, what it's saying is that energy degenerates over time, which will ultimately lead to the destruction of the universe. Much like in morals theory, the individual and family morally and genetically degenerate over time, which inescapably results in the extinction of the family line. So here we have the destruction of the family line and the destruction of the universe itself. Rudolf Clausius was a leading figure in the theory of entropy and was colleagues with Hermann von Helmholtz. So here we see sort of ties between entropy and early experimental psychology. So Helmholtz's work led to the development of early experimental psychology and was really influenced Freud's death drive theory and concept of transference. Also, Helmholtz's work was tied to Spiritism in the writings of German physicist Johann Carl Friedrich Zollner, who used Helmholtz's ideas to make a case for the existence of spirits and as empirical proof of magic. And Helmholtz was a pretty staunch positivist, so he wasn't very happy that Zollner was trying to use his ideas to prove that magic and spirits were real. So they had a very sort of tumultuous kind of relationship. Also, interestingly, around the same time, we see Maxwell's demon arise. So this was a thought experiment developed by James Clerk Maxwell in 1867, which employed a demon to theoretically reverse entropy and undermine the second law of thermodynamics. So really interesting during a time when psychiatry and the medical world is just like desperately trying to rid itself of any kind of supernatural metaphysical influence. We see physics, like super hard science, bringing back in the metaphysical through Maxwell's demon. And because this thought experiment undermines the second law of thermodynamics, it's gotten a lot of attention in the world of physics, and physicists have been attempting to exorcise the demon ever since. And that's actually like the term they use in the literature, which I thought was really funny. Okay. Whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. Okay. So last piece of the metabletic analysis. So we see entropic themes really present throughout decadent literature, especially in Baudelaire's poetry and in the femme fatale. So again, much like sort of entropy has influence and implications for sort of information processing and literature, we see entropy also influencing the arts and literature. That's really the great thing about metabletics is a really like good analysis. You can see how all of these are sort of intertwined and influence one another, and how individuals within these disciplines also are intertwined and influence one another. So we can really see entropic themes in Baudelaire's poem, From the Depths I Cried. So in the poem, he evokes imagery that's posted here as a sun with heatless beams. So really evoking imagery of the heat death of the universe, no greenery, no trees, the cruelty of the blank sun's cold glass, and that long night, that chaos come again. So here we see, again, themes of the heat death of the universe, themes of disorder and order, chaos and nothingness. And we can also see this in a number of Baudelaire's poems about vampires, has very similar entropic themes. And also very broadly speaking, within the decadence movement, the femme fatale is really depicted as the degenerate woman and as the representation of the end of civilization. So we see very animalistic imagery evoked in decadent writers and in the femme fatale, who is portrayed as beautiful, violent, sexually perverse and aggressive, unmotherly. And the femme fatale is understood as representing the female of the modern age, sort of seemingly blurs the lines between male and female. Actually, doctors during this time warned that increasing female independence witnessed in modernity was contributing to women not fulfilling their desires or duties of motherhood, and labeled such women as degenerates. So really, like the femme fatale, again, can sort of represent the end of civilization, because if women aren't having babies, then that's it for humanity. And this idea that the end of the world, or the idea that nothing can escape decay, is really evident across the decadence work. So we see it in H.G. Wells' Time Machine, where it ends with this sort of apocalyptic scene where the sun is dying and the only life left are monstrous beings, and in other works as well. But again, there's this sort of appreciation, this beauty found in destruction and death. Okay, so overall, just sort of sum all of that up, moral theory of degeneration reveals the societal theme of degeneration that was really pervasive throughout French culture during decades of political turmoil and counter-revolutions following the French Revolution, and is demonstrated throughout psychiatry, the literature and the arts, the occult, spiritism, physics, eugenics, and ultimately modern psychology. So I know I only have a little bit of time left, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time, but just to sort of show like, okay, well, where do we go from here? So through this analysis, we really see the creation of a scapegoat. And earlier in my dissertation, in my literature review, I talk about René Girard's scapegoat mechanism, and this idea that addicted individuals are scapegoated in society. And I think we can really see this in the degenerate created in mid to late 19th century France. So as we saw, France during this time is really just a society in chaos, really decaying under political turmoil and instability caused by revolution after revolution, where we see all of these sort of warring factions that I talked about earlier. So like the monarchy and traditional Catholics versus folk tradition Catholics versus anti-clerics and positivists. So if they keep fighting, they're all going to eventually just destroy one another. So what is needed, according to René Girard, is a scapegoat to sort of satiate the need for violence. So medical discourse outs and scapegoats a subsection of persons as degenerates, which really satiates society's desire for violence. So it allows for everybody to sort of move away from the social and all sort of the messed up things that are going on with all these revolutions and say like, hey, no, it's not really society, it's these people, it's these degenerates that are causing the problem. And if we just like remove them or treat them, then we can sort of resolve what's going on. So we see the degenerate as being demonized, as pathological, while also being deified through the decadence movement. And that was something very important for Girard, that the scapegoat is both demonized and deified simultaneously. And as I mentioned, this sort of allows for peace between the warring factions and prevents the destruction of society, because again, we can place all the blame on the degenerate. And from this perspective, we might understand this medical model conceptualization of mental illness and substance addiction as really a covering over of the influence that the religious, that the occult and spiritism had on leaders associated with early positivist movement and early psychology. I don't know about anybody else, but I know looking at like intro to psychology books, there was never anything about, you know, the occult or spiritism or anything like that on our early psychologists. And I think, again, we're sort of covering over our history or not taking a look at like what are the actual influences on our history as psychologists. And as we see that locating degeneration in the individual rather than looking at society as a whole leads to some pretty scary solutions. So solutions that were found in eugenics, and also in individualized approaches to treatment, which I argue throughout my dissertation, really don't get at the societal issues that maybe contribute to or cause addiction. And scapegoating with it carries implications that these stories sort of remain untaught, but are, again, critical to understanding where our beliefs come from. Beliefs that are now presented as objective reality, that the disease model is just objective reality, but really no, as we see, it's very steeped in history and politics. Another theme that we see arising from this analysis is this idea of the degenerate self. So we can understand this sort of empty, flattened self, which I reference. Philip Cushman's idea of the empty, flattened self is really a degenerate self that begins in the 19th century and carries through to today. So we understand the empty self as trying to fill an unfillable void, this flattened self as a self attempting to sort of shape shift as a way to entertain, impress, avoid the other, replace the other with a drug, avoid like intimate relating, and similar to how this empty self attempts to fill a sense of lack with drugs, and how this multiple flattened self attempts to use them as a way to impress, entertain, and avoid. The degenerate self, as we saw in the decadence, really seemed to use substances as a way to numb, as a way to escape the anxiety and dread associated with living in a society that's totally in tatters. And we can see parallels between this and Brent's anesthetic culture that he writes about in his book, which for him is really characterized by tendencies to objectify self, others, and the natural world, And for Brent, anesthetic culture is really correlated with colonialism, genocide of indigenous peoples in the US, rampant drug and alcohol addiction, and the emergence of new anesthetics in medicine, all of which sort of culminate in this cultural numbing and a very mechanistic, objectifying way of viewing self, others, in the world. So again, we see Brent's observations finding this dehumanization and numbing taking place during the same time period that I explored in this dissertation, although in the US as opposed to Europe. And we might understand these parallel developments of cultural numbing and objectification in both the US and Europe, that suggesting this phenomenon is really reflective of something larger than just one continent, but perhaps maybe reflective of the reality of the time period in question. Additionally, drug use for the decadents and the occultists really provides a sense of connection through a deviant subculture. Sure, a connection that was much needed and valued during a time when society was in such upheaval and people were fighting with one another. And it also allows for meaning and purpose in a world that's increasingly stripped of the metaphysical and this move to a more positivist way of understanding. And we might understand, taking a more sort of Levinasian approach, that this move to a more positivist understanding of mental health issues and substance addiction is a way of rejecting, or in Levinasian terms, totalizing the other. So rather than understanding the other within their context, we're just essentializing them or totalizing them as disease, sick, addicted, mentally ill. So the call of the other isn't heard from this perspective, it's just rejected and escaped by putting the label of degenerate or addict or whatever on them, rather than trying to understand them. And sort of reducing the experience of the other to a biological disease prohibits the call of the other from being heard, and again, sort of serves as an escape. So healing, therefore, requires meaningful connections, which just aren't adequately facilitated in current mainstream approaches to addiction and treatment. At least that's what I argue. And then very briefly, just implications for healing. Again, sort of our hope in this presentation was to provide a pretty thorough understanding of what a metabletic analysis can look like. So I'm definitely not doing like this part justice, but really my hope in presenting this dissertation and presenting our work will really inspire creativity or new ways of thinking about and treating addiction that allows for more fluidity in treatment rather than the rigidity that I argue is present in contemporary forms of addiction treatment. So I offer just a few paths forward. So I talk about experiential personal construct psychology, radical community psychology, and a cultural existential therapy, and also talk about sort of trying to address polarization in society through mutual dialogue and understanding. As all paths forward, as all ways that really encapsulate the Levinasian ethical relation, or ways of relating with people that emphasize genuine connection, reverence, and the dignity of the other, which I really argue is missing from predominant theories of addiction. So very broadly speaking, experiential personal construct psychology allows for the reverencing of the other through understanding pathology as a crisis of meaning making or struggle to meaningfully relate to the other. So in this process, both therapist and client are challenged to be open to the process of meaningfully relating. So rather than sort of retreating or running away from the other in the form of labeling them with, DSM diagnostic labels or labeling them as degenerate, you're really trying to understand the person within their context and understand them in ways that allow for opening up future possibilities. I also talk about McInerney's radical community psychology, which is really grounded in existentialism, phenomenology, and the hermeneutics of love, which is really grounded in a very careful listening, humility, action. And again, I'm running out of time, but there are parallels between this radical community psychology and experiential personal contract psychology, which again, both sort of allow for this reverencing and dignity of the other. for McInerney, it's a response to the call of the other, suffering with the other, through this emphasis on shared burdens or things that we all sort of essentially share as part of being human, such as the fact that we will all die one day. And through this, through McInerney's pathway to research and community engagement, it also allows for an understanding or recognition of how we are embedded in the various systems that we are trying to study and understand, which is critical if we're going to work towards any kind of societal change. In EPCP, although it's more an individualized approach to therapy, it also touches on transpersonal reverence, or this idea that through the hope of working together as therapist and client, that the individual will be able to see how that they are related to one another, human and non-human world, and the universe itself. So again, sort of a move towards something greater than oneself. And then a cultural existential therapy proposed by Felder and Robbins really captured sort of the person-centeredness of EPCP, an emphasis on cultural consciousness raising, and McInerney's radical community psychology. So again, they're all sort of intertwined and influence one another. And they also suggest, Felder and Robbins, that a cultural therapeutics or a metabletic approach can be used as a way to understand cultural symptoms that result in the cultural marginalization, traumatization, and re-traumatization of those that inhabit it. So through this understanding, steps can be taken to ameliorate the cultural symptoms, which is what we're sort of trying to do through this analysis. And then lastly, I talk about addressing polarization in society through mutual dialogue and understanding. And although I don't have time to go into all of this right now, I've referenced individuals such as Kirk Schneider, Charles Taylor, Emmanuel Levinas, Gadamer, Edward Sampson, as just a few individuals who have written on or thought about these ideas, again, as a way to address the polarization of society so that there's no longer a need for a scapegoat, and that we can begin to address some of the societal issues that are contributing to and causing substance addiction and mental health issues. Great, and with that, thank you all for your time and attention.
Yeah, that was great, Ashley. Thank you. Yeah, it's fun. I've heard this a couple of times now, and it's something. Every time I hear it, it's I see more things than I did the last time.
Yeah.
There's a lot to contemplate here. So yeah, and thank you everybody. Even though we don't know who you are, who watched this, you can contact us. My email is brobbins with 2 B's, BRO. Wait, what is my email address? PROBBINS@pointpark.edu. And what's your address? A Bobak?
It's AL Bobak, BOBAK @pointpark.edu.
Yeah, so feel free to reach out if you have any questions, or if you like a copy of the presentation.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Let us know, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Yeah, thank you all so much.